Well, the story of the day is, of course, the news from the Vatican that George Pell has died. Despite a wrongful conviction, he died an innocent man and maintained his grace and composure in the face of extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Andrew Bolt knew Cardinal Pell and defended him when few others would, and he joins me now. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Thanks, Caleb.
As someone who knew him, and obviously you did the last Australian interview with Cardinal Pell, which we'll be screening tonight, what were your reflections today?
Well, I thought mixed, part, well, they can't hurt him anymore. Second, I wish he'd lived, though, to see the full vindication. He was vindicated 7-0 by the High Court. But even if you just go, I recommend you don't do it. If you go on Twitter today, you will see so much hate, vile celebration about George Pell's death. From not just lowlifes, but, former Senator Darren Hinch and all that kind of thing. It's just disgusting. And for me, it's sort of like this is the division. George Pell would never have spoken about his enemies like some of his enemies are speaking about him today. The glee of his death, hoping that he died painfully, the abuse, the foul language. Pell would never have done that. He was a Christian. And I think in the end, a lot of journalists did not understand that. It was like he was something strange. He was someone out of their control, not on their wavelength. They wanted him to suffer, and in the end, they helped hound him into jail for 404 days for a crime he could not possibly have committed.
Well, that's it. I mean, that trial and obviously the media circus that ensued was a pretty dark time in Australian journalism. I mean, it seemed as though a lot of the news media had decided he was guilty before the trial had even been run, and ultimately we know he spent time in jail. Have we actually learnt any lessons from that event, do you think?
I don't think we have, because the people responsible for this grotesque miscarriage of justice have not apologised, have not changed, have not admitted to any fault at all. I'm talking about the police, for instance, Victoria Police, who advertised for so-called victims, eventually found 9 people. They lodged 26 charges. All of those charges were so preposterous that they ultimately failed. Some didn't even make it to court. They were so intrinsically stupid. The merest investigation made them impossible to believe. Why haven't they been held to account for that? What other citizen in this country has had that done to them? And then the 2 Victorian Supreme Court judges who dismissed his first appeal, even though the 3rd judge on that tribunal, on that panel, went at great lengths to show why this alleged rape could not possibly have happened. He allegedly raped 2 boys at once in his cathedral, even though one of the boys, now dead, said it never happened. And even though, when you had a look at the evidence, neither George Pell, the alleged rapist, nor the alleged victim could have been in the room where it happened, allegedly, at the time this claimant said, because it was a sacristy just after Mass being used by people going to and fro, and changing, bringing back sacred objects from the Mass. The whole thing was just preposterous, yet people to this day still believe it. And I find that amazing. And what's even more amazing to me is that through all of this, George Pell retained his faith in his God. He remained a man of faith, the sort of person that modern journalists don't seem to understand, to the point, the last time he rang me was from Rome a few months ago. And the thing that was bothering him was whether I'd converted to Christianity. I hadn't, and I was apologetic. He even sent me books to help me in my journey, and I felt really guilty about it. But he was a man of God, and people do not understand this.
It always seemed to me that the trial of George Pell was never so much about George Pell as it was about the Catholic Church, and that they had basically picked him as the most senior Catholic in Australia, as the man that had to take the fall for the sins of the Church. And then when that all ultimately fell apart in the High Court, it felt like a terrible moment for the entire cause of trying to repair what was done within the Catholic Church, because they had pinned their hopes on one man who was ultimately found not to have committed the crime that he was accused of. It just felt like he had to take the fall for so much that was not of his doing, and he was the whipping boy, basically.
Well, you must also acknowledge that for a couple of decades before then, he was already on the media hate list. I'm talking particularly the ABC, which unanimously was against Pell for decades because he was conservative, because he tried to make priests follow the teaching of the church rather than a left-wing gospel, because he did things like question the global warming religion, which he correctly saw as a rival faith to the Christian one. He did all that. In the end, it was only in the last few years that it was, and as a pedophile as well, and that's when, of course, it all hit it. But you still see what you describe to this very day. It is impossible to believe, when you look at the evidence, that this man raped two boys at once, two teenagers. He didn't know them at all, in an open-door room over 5 minutes when there was no possibility that they wouldn't have been interrupted in those 5 minutes. I mean, the whole thing was just absurd. He is innocent. Yet right now you've got people like the Prime Minister, like Darren Hinch, say, oh, look, it's a difficult day for Catholics. You've got Louise Milligan, the ABC journalist, who made a mozza writing books falsely spearing him as a pedophile. Oh, this is a triggering day for victims. Look, it's an insult to victims of Catholic priests, pedophile priests, and they did exist, and may they rot in hell, some of them.
Indeed.
It is an insult to them to think that they would or should feel better by jailing an innocent man for crimes he could not possibly have committed. How on earth is that justice? And why do politicians and even some priests, some bishops to this day, why do they tiptoe around and say, oh, we're really sorry for the victims, we've got to remember the victims this day that George Pell is dead? No, he's an innocent man, And he was the victim of one of the most grotesque miscarriages of justice in Australian legal history.
Well, following my show this evening, we'll be playing your interview with Pell back in 2020 when he came out of prison. Let's just take a quick listen to some of what he said at the time.
The moment in court when you heard the word guilty, what went through your mind?
I don't know whether much did. I was too busy keeping control of myself. It was a blow and I just had to put up with it.
You obviously saw him after what would have been one of the darkest times in his life. What stood out to you about him then?
He had a sense of injustice. He felt that there was something going on with the Victoria Police, and I believe is absolutely correct. But he showed an amazing forgiveness for the man who'd falsely accused him. I find that, look, I say, to his last days, he was a true Christian trying to live up to the faith of Jesus Christ. I'm not a Christian, but I greatly admire that. And I think a lot of people today should remember him as having followed Christ in one thing. He was unfairly accused, he was crucified, and he died for the sins of others.
Andrew Bolt, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.